one kind of housekeeping thing. I can't see a clock right now, so if you can just flag me when I need to stop.
Okay.
I'll try and...
Somebody should have done that to me, right?
Yeah, I will try and stay on time, but I want to also give you guys enough time to ask me questions. I'm going to be talking about quite a bit of data today, and there will be graphs and charts. So fair warning, there are a lot of them. I'll try and make them interesting as I go through, but know that lines and bars will be present in almost every slide. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about these kind of demographic trends that we're seeing in the state of Minnesota and really nationwide. From the conversation that we just had at your tables, I'm going to kind of zoom out and take a bigger picture look at some of the context of what's happening in the state of Minnesota for what you're talking about at your tables individually. So that individual work that you guys were talking about that you need to do on your own, this is the 50,000 foot level that we'll talk about a little bit. And we tweet, if you tweet, and want to mention some of the things that you see here, include at MN Compass. I don't know how to do this very well. I'm kind of learning, but somebody else on our staff tweets a lot. So it's always really appreciated when, especially folks at presentations, share things that they think are interesting. And you might be asking, well, what is Minnesota Compass? In addition to a project of Wilder Research, we describe ourselves as a data indicators project, and our main purpose and kind of reason for being is that we want to give folks in our state, like yourselves, so community leaders, community members, as well as policymakers, business leaders, other neighborhood groups, the information that they need to both understand and act on the issues that impact their community. And part of that information is that it's a common foundation. So I might be on one side of an issue, somebody else might be on another, but we're really looking at that same set of data. So we can say, here's what we know is going on in the state. As much as we can be certain about reality, this is what we can say about some of the data that's happening in the state. We do that primarily through a website called mncompass.org. So most of the stuff that you see today will be available on the website. But we also do, obviously, presentations like this. This is one of my favorites, to get out of the office and to get into the community and talk to people about some of the numbers that I look at all day. So we are funded by a number of different organizations and foundations throughout the state of Minnesota. And I always want to take an opportunity to say thank you to these folks, because it's what allows me to be here today. It also is the thing that kind of fuels our website and allows this great data to exist. So thank you to all of these foundations. If you know them or you're one of them, thank you. So today we're going to talk about three kind of big ideas. The first is aging, and the second is racial and ethnic diversity. And I always say, if you're talking to a demographer and they're not talking to you about aging or racial and ethnic diversity, get a new demographer. I mean, I don't know if you I don't have a demographer on hand, but if you do, call a different one, because that's not the way. These are the two major trends of our time right now, and they're very related. And I think that relation is a really interesting question for us tonight as well. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the workforce. So really the impacts of aging and racial and ethnic diversity for the workforce. We'll get into disparities in the workforce as well, and kind of some other elements that go into it. So first, to talk about aging. A little bit of a quiz for you guys. So in the Twin Cities, the largest share of the population is currently who? A, young children. B, school-age children, so 5 to 17. C, working-age adults. Or D, retirement-age adults, those 65-plus folks. Who says it's A, young children? Largest group. B, school-age children. C, working-age adults. Or D, retirement-age adults. Okay, this is great. So half and half about said C and D. It's C. It's working age adults, and it will always be working age adults unless something really crazy happens. Because this is 46 years of our lives, so a huge portion. I know it's tricky. It's a little bit of a tricky. It's not equal years up and down the options. So this is a big one. But this is another question we can kind of help us look at what's happening. What's the second largest share of the population? Why don't you just shout out what you think the second largest share is?
D.
Everybody's saying D. All right. Psych! I got you. It's not D. It's D. It's school-age population, but it won't be like that for very long, and that's what's so interesting. And kind of what we're seeing as such a big change in our region and in the state. The state demographer projects that by 2020, the retirement age adult population will exceed the school age population for the first time, at least since 1950, if not much earlier than that. So this is the first time in our history that we're going to have more older adults than we have people, kids go in school. In the rest of the state, we can see that aging is already happening and taking place. For example, in the Northland region where Duluth is, the retirement age population already exceeds the school age population. I'm not sure if it made headlines there the day that happened, but it has. So in 2012, we see that there are 27 counties that have more than 20% of their population who are 65 plus. So that's the 1 in 5 figure, tells us that that's a large share of the population that is an older adult. But projections say that by 2020, we're looking at 54 counties that will have more than 20% who are 65 plus. And then by 2030, we're looking at 79, and actually I think it's 80, I miscounted it, 80 counties that will have a population of 65 or older, 20% or larger. So this is really dramatic. And it starts in the outstate and then it's coming in year by year. These states here that you see are not in the purple color. They're really close behind. So if you're like, oh, I live in Hennepin and Ramsey, no big deal. We're looking at 17 and 18% of the population will be 65 plus. So this shift is happening statewide from the outside in. It's really unlike anything that we've seen before. If we look again at that decade by decade chart, we see that this is what each decade we've had an additional 67,000, 47,000 of those 65 plus populations. So it kind of bobbles up and down a little bit. But in the 10, so from 10 to 20, we're looking at an addition of 288,000 65 plus adults. And then when we look in the 20s, we're looking at an additional 335,000 adults who are 65 plus. And then you have these kind of smaller ones here. But these adults who became 65 plus, they're still 65 plus over here. So it keeps on adding to it. One of the big impacts that we see on the economic side of this aging question, I think there are a lot of ways to look at aging. Volunteerism, social connectedness, overall health of the population. There are a lot of ways to look at it. This economic piece, at least, is telling us that in 2010, what we have are 6 workers, so working age adults, I should say. Probably not all of them are working, as we know, but we have 6 working age adults to support 1 retiree. And that figure has been about the same, again, since 1950. It's really just kind of moved up and down a little bit. But when we look at what that figure will be in 2040 in the metro, it's 2.5 working age adults for each retiree. That's a huge shift. And the reason that that's happening is that the working age population, that huge portion, 18 to 64, they're not increasing population to match what's happening with the aging population. The boomers really just, it's something that we have not seen since, obviously. When we look at this, so this is that 6% increase, and then it's 130% increase of the retiree population. One of the things that we're really asking of these 2.5 people is to be as productive as these 6 people are today. So in 30 years, we're going to be asking 2.5 workers to be, functionally as productive, meaning things like Social Security inputs and taxes, in order for these folks to have a same or similar experience. Sneak peek, we're barely graduating 60% of our high school students in the Twin Cities. So asking that of those 2.5 people is a bit of a question. I see there's one.
Yeah, I was wondering, are the purple people, are they like kids of the retirees?
They
Or-
could be, yeah. I'm not, because for example, by 2040, well, let's start here. I have a retiree parent, and I'm one of these, but I don't have to be. I mean,
so
it
what's
could.
happening? Are we disappearing? Or are we?
No, that's a really good question, because where you're seeing the changes on the bottom, but actually for the visualization, but what's actually happening is this number is growing. So the ratio is changing. You're getting way more 65 plus, and the number that are 18 to 64 are staying the same. That's that 6%. So we're not matching the increase on top.
I think the question is, what does support retirees mean?
Yeah, and support retirees. So yeah, not necessarily parents. That's a thing. It's about contributing to kind of the economic system that allows retirees to have Social Security, Medicaid, that sort of stuff. Medicare.
But the retirees put in money all their lives. to
Yeah.
the system, so it's not like they.
Oh yeah, I'm not making a value judgment. I'm saying that.
It doesn't make sense economically, but you're saying that they're supporting the retirees, but the retirees have been supporting themselves all along by
Yeah.
contributing to the system.
Yep.
But not anymore, not when you retire. That's changed.
Right, and so just the sheer number of the retirees in that space, in the retirement age population. I mean, I can't get into the details of the Social Security funding crisis. I'm not totally sure about the ins and outs of that. But what we're saying is that the worker to retiree ratio will change dramatically in the next 30 years, and there are implications for that, economically speaking.
Well, I think one of the things you can say, Jane, when you say worker, it's paid work and unpaid work as well. So fewer people volunteering, as you had mentioned earlier, towards retirees. So people taking out Meals on Wheels and things
Yeah.
like that aren't happening in certain counties.
That's
right
another
now
great way to think about it. Yeah,
because
it's
they
not
don't
just
have enough
financial.
people to do it.
Right, right. That's a great point. Yeah.
Well, to explain how Social Security works, when you're working,
Hold on, I've got a limited amount of time. I think getting into Social Security is going to be pretty, I think maybe down the line we can talk about it, but I think to get through the topics, let's hold off and then we can tackle
I was
Social
just going
Security.
to say how it affects. That's all. Because if you're working now, you think you're working to save for your Social Security. No, you're paying for
Right,
the other person.
you're paying for the people who are there now.
Who are there now.
Exactly.
That's
That's,
all I
yep.
want to say.
Okay, I didn't know if you were going to go into
No,
it.
no,
Um,
I just want to.
I think people get their PhDs
No.
in that. I don't have one. So the aging population, what does it mean? There are obviously advantages and challenges that we've talked about. So I'll kind of skip this slide a little bit, but know that they're both there. I'm not saying it's all going to be a rough spot. There are a lot of really strong and great elements of having the aging population, especially in the state of Minnesota. The next thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is kind of a flip side of that coin, which is racial and ethnic diversity. And when I say, oh, here, let's do this quiz. In the Twin Cities, what share of children under 5 are of color? A, 25%, B, 41%, C, 62%, or D, 73%? Who says A, 25%?
I say,
A? Okay, who says B, 41%? All right, who says C, 62%? Okay, D, 73%. It is 41%. Now, folks who said 62%, can you raise your hand again? How many of you live or work in the city of St. Paul? Okay, a lot of you. That's what the figure is for, just the city of St. Paul. So we're talking about the 7-county metro, but if you're looking just at St. Paul, it's 61%. So the city is much further along demographically on that front. So Twin Cities is obviously becoming far more diverse than it has been. And one of the things that we say is that this diversification is really generational. And what I mean by that is we have a lot of, when we look at this chart, there are white, non-Hispanic on this side as a percentage of the total population with all these ages, and then the population of color. What's one thing, point out something about this chart that they notice. It's flipped. Yeah, it's not exact, but it's pretty darn close. So we're looking at the communities of color are far larger at the younger age, which is one trend that Damon mentioned. And then we're seeing white non-Hispanic is much larger in this baby boom generation. So the way we think about that is, you know, the trend in the white non-Hispanic population for the metro is one of contraction. When you look just at those babies, 0 to 5, there was an actual decrease of about 15% from 2000 to 2010 in the number of under 5 kids who are white. But if you look at that same age cohort, or the same age group, those little under 5 kids, there's been an expansion in the of 51% for the under 5 population of color. So for the entire population, just 20% of the white non-Hispanic folks in the Twin Cities are under 20. But for populations of color, it's 40%. So this is really just another way to look at kind of this expansion here and how you're much more likely to be of color if you're young. Or I should say, that the youngest are much larger for the populations of color at the youngest ages. So nearly all growth in the metro and in Minnesota is from populations of color. We talk about in the last decade. That population change for the white non-Hispanic community, or the white non-Hispanic community is about 2%. And then for populations of color, we see that increase is more like 63%. So when I say nearly all the growth, I mean that the Twin Cities grew 10% in the last decade, and 97% of that growth is from populations of color. So without that growth, especially if you think about the city of St. Paul, without the growth of populations of color in the city of St. Paul, it would have actually lost 24,000 people. As it is, the city lost about 2,000, but it would have been much larger if it had not been for growth in the foreign-born and populations of color. So this is the future of our region in a major way. Now, we're still 75% white in the Twin Cities, but that is something that's shifting really dramatically. We know that the phrase of color, it's one large, huge category. But when you look at what has happened decade by decade, we've seen that in 1990, populations of color, it's 1 in 10. 2000, it's about 1 in 6, and then again in 2012, we're looking at 1 in 4 who are of color. And so while we talk about it in this large term, we also at Compass try and take a look at in a little bit more depth of where that growth is coming from among the populations, the races that we could have termed of color, and we're often termed of color. And when we look at the growth, it's not one particular race group that's growing and really driving this. We see that there's been a very large increase since 1990 in the Hispanic, Black, and Asian community. American Indian really has been fairly steady, and then in 2000 we had the addition of the race category 2 or more races for the way the census looks at it. So we can also see that that's growing. But we know that the growth has contributing. It's been contributed by all 3 groups, and then also 2 or more races. Greater Minnesota is also diversifying, albeit really unevenly. So when we look at county by county, Hennepin and Ramsey are here, Mahnomen up here with 51%, and then we have growth in Nobles and Watonwan. Does anybody have a guess as to what is driving much of the growth out in this southern? Ooh, yeah, you guys, you got it. When we look at Nobles, we see that it's home to the highest share county-wise, I should say, of Hispanic residents in the state. And one of those drivers is really jobs and the economy. And so when we look at the economic opportunities in Nobles, we can see that while manufacturing over the decade went down in the state of Minnesota, in Nobles County it went up. We have the share of the jobs in Nobles in manufacturing increased, and so did the Hispanic population. So when you go to Nobles and chat with people about what happened, that really has risen to the top of some of those changes. Now, one of the things that also changes when you have a new population in a county is that their kids come with them. So we're looking at 1 in 3 youth in Nobles County are Hispanic. And that brings about a whole host of challenges that I think some folks mentioned. advantages and challenges for the school system, including things like ELL education and rethinking the way of doing school and doing education than probably had been in previous decades. And so that I think lends itself into workforce, but before I jump into this, I just want to leave room for questions for anybody about that last portion, racial and ethnic diversity. Yeah?
I'm just thinking, when you point out that these increases in people of color all over the state increasing and stuff like that, doesn't it open the door for a backlash or some kind of problems to arise out of this? Because some people will feel threatened that they're being overtaken.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think community by community it varies. I do know of an example in, I think it's Wilmer, Minnesota, that Candy Ojai County saw like in the last, I think, few years, they saw a growth of the East African community in Candy Ojai and in Wilmer. And there's been a lot of work with different community groups to start conversations like what we're having today about that change and about the kind of cross-cultural communications that need to happen in a new place like that. So I think, I imagine change is hard regardless. So maybe there is room for backlash, I'm not sure. Yeah.
I've seen this presentation before by the different colleagues,
Yeah.
but I think it was before the census was completed.
Mm-hmm.
So, since we've already had a full decade of the census, are you sort of predicting these last few years, the numbers to add to that, to estimate that the growth?
Yeah, so the 2020, 2030, and 2040 numbers are projections.
Well, but even the 2012,
Nope, that we have a way that we can look at it. The census gives us new numbers every year.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you give me some clarity about, my understanding is that every census, every 10 years, that there is so many dollars allocated to different districts because of the census, it's federal monies that's given, and then there are, because of either poverty or population of people of color, how that money is distributed for economic development.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the case, that money is allocated maybe to a metro area based on those numbers and based on the share in poverty or based on a variety of factors. So these data that we're looking at, they do go to the feds. The federal government sees them, and state government makes a lot of decisions based on these realities, both at the county level and then city, and then sometimes even as small as a neighborhood level. We can look at these and say, what's happening in this kind of neighborhood? What kind of funding or program should go into this? Yep, definitely.
Could you just say some more how you count 12, 13?
Yeah, without getting into too much detail, maybe you and I can talk about it after. I can give you more information than probably any of us even wants. But basically, there's a survey that goes out. 1 in 38 people are surveyed, and they ask you questions. And then we tally them up.
So some kind of community survey.
The American Community Survey is the term. Yep. Last one, and then I'm going to get to the workforce stuff.
I remember the story of how the United States Congress during Reconstruction spent an entire day debating the question of whether Italians were white.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, they
Yeah.
concluded they were not. And so I'm wondering what definition is being used
Yeah.
in your data for
That is a great question.
people of color and people not of color.
Did anybody go to the Science Museum exhibit like 4 years ago about race? So that, I mean, it is a construct of the bureaucracy of the census that I am talking about, and I will willingly admit that, or not even admit, but explain that. So we're working with what the phrase we use is white non-Hispanic. So that means that somebody checked a box that said they're white, and then they checked a box that said they don't have a Hispanic ethnicity. If you don't match those two boxes, then that of color term is the remainder. So I don't know how that person who's Italian would answer, frankly. But if they
That's
answer,
really a subjective term, that you're.
absolutely. It's self-identified, and it's very problematic, generally speaking. I mean, I think there's a lot of room for critique about how the government categorizes race. And you can put that from the district on up. We got to roll? Yeah. Okay. Know that I want to take all these questions and would love to talk about these for a very long time, but I'm going to zoom a little bit here, okay? So our dynamic metropolitan workforce, all this boils down into what does this mean for our workforce? We know that there will be 400,000 replacement openings by 2020, about 200,000 new hires, and 200,000 new jobs, and we're talking about 600,000 total new hires through 2020. But we only have 55,000 additional working age people who are going to be in the Twin Cities by 2020. So when we talk about aging, this is part of what we're seeing, is that our working age population isn't going to grow enough to meet some of this demand. So the question is, who will fill these jobs? We know that these jobs are going to require some level of post-secondary education, not necessarily a bachelor's degree. We can look at vocational tech and associate's degrees, but at 2/3 of the jobs, those 600,000 jobs, will require some level of post-secondary. The jobs that pay the best and have the highest growth, they're going to require even more education, or are more likely to require higher education. And then while we are home to one of the best and brightest talent pools in the metro area, we're number 5 for the young adults with a bachelor's degree, we have some pretty abysmal disparities when we look at preparing our population for the workforce. So adult educational attainment has widened. The gap has widened since the year 2000. It was 13%. Now it's about 15 percentage points. So it's gotten a bit bigger since that 2000 mark. And the majority of Twin Cities college students graduate and transfer within 150% time, which is a really important kind of workforce preparation measure. So our institutions are doing an all right job of getting people through the programs. However, there are gaps when we look at those on-time graduation rates by race and ethnicity, or by race, I should say. About 50, again, that 15 percentage point for the 4-year institution and 10 percentage point gap for the 2-year institutions. And while nearly 3/4 of Twin Cities high school students graduate on time, we have nearly half American Indian, Black, and Hispanic students do not graduate on time. So and when you look at our rank statewide, so how we rank in the state of Minnesota as compared to other states, we are near the bottom for every one of those population groups for graduating people on time. It's a 43 percentage point gap in 2012. Just a second. We know too that STEM, which is a term that means science, technology, engineering, and math, is getting a lot of attention right now, and folks are saying this is the growth area, this is where jobs are going to be. And in fact, we know that it's projected that the STEM jobs will grow faster than other types of employment. And yet, when we look at 5th grade science, that kind of our first measure of science proficiency in the schools, it varies widely. Less than 1/3 of American Indian, Black, and Hispanic students are proficient in 5th grade science. So when we look at these gaps from what we call cradle to career, this kind of young age to older educational opportunities, we can see that our metro is not doing a good job of providing the same educational or creating the same educational outcomes for all students. And when we're talking about the future of the metro and the future of the state to be most likely more and increasingly populations of color, these are real questions about our educational outcomes. I don't think these are things that I'm telling you and you've never heard before. And I want to recognize that, but we also, seeing it in one place with these numbers is pretty stark. So if we remember this slide, kind of what we had talked about, the fact that the generational changes and diversification of the generations, we look at this slide, which tells us that by 2040, 43% of the working age population will be of color. And this one that we talked about, these are kind of the component factors for big questions about our workforce that I think the next section our panel will discuss that quite a bit and kind of bring some life to what our graphs and charts, but are representative of what's happening right now and what is projected to happen for the region. So the future really does depend on how we address these challenges, both as individuals and for ourselves, and then what we do as a community. I won't spend a ton of time on these. Please know that you can go to minnesotacompass.org and get the majority of these data, mncompass.org. We do have information about neighborhoods, so if you're working on the neighborhood level and you're interested, we do have some kind of big picture items and data about neighborhoods, and they will be updated sometime this year. So if you've looked at them before and you're familiar with the 2011 version, a 2014 version will be coming out. Please sign up for our e-newsletter. You can do that on the website, and then follow us on Twitter and connect with us on Facebook. If you're on Facebook and you're on Twitter, do both, because we post different things. Different people do those, so we can kind of spice it up a little bit. Thanks, you guys. Thanks.